All living organisms in the world are made up of cells, and there's only two types of cells in our world. There's prokaryotic cells and there's eukaryotic cells. So bacteria and archaea are made up of prokaryotic cells, and everything else that's living is made up of eukaryotic cells, like human cells, plant cells, mold cells, eukaryotic cells. And then viruses are not made up of prokaryotic cells, they're not made up of eukaryotic cells, and the reason is that they're not living. It's really important to understand cell structures, especially in microbiology, because if you're trying to treat a bacterial infection, you should really understand what a prokaryotic cell looks like, which is what bacteria are made up of, and then what happens in human cells, and human cells are made up of eukaryotic cells. So these are the two types of cells in the world. Now, the similarities between these two types of cells, between all cells in the world, is all cells in the world have a plasma membrane. That's also called cell membrane. It's the same thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is all cells in the world have DNA. DNA is what is their genetic material. It says why some bacteria are more pathogenic than others, or for humans, why we look different among each other. And then the third thing is all cells in the world have ribosomes. Ribosomes make proteins, and proteins are so important for cells. We'll learn about that later. And then finally, the inside of the cell is called the cytoplasm. All cells have cytoplasm. So the four things that all cells in the world have is a plasma membrane, DNA, ribosomes, and cytoplasm. The differences between these cells are, we say that prokaryotic cells are typically smaller and they're a little bit simpler. Eukaryotic cells are larger, a little bit more complex. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells have something called a nucleus. It's another layer of protection for DNA. So for prokaryotes, the DNA is just floating around in a region. We call that region the nucleoid. It's not a nucleus, it's just a region. In eukaryotic cells, like human cells, we have a nucleus, and the nucleus protects the DNA. Also, eukaryotic cells have something called organelles, like mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, things like that, and prokaryotic cells do not. And then there's one more difference, but I'm forgetting. Okay, so prokaryotic cells is no nucleus, no organelles, smaller. And then eukaryotic cells is they have a nucleus, they have organelles. Oh, I remembered, reproduction. Okay, so eukaryotic cells divide by something called mitosis and meiosis, which you learn about later. Prokaryotic cells just split, and we call that binary fission. So those are the main differences. Again, it's so important to understand cells, because if you're treating a bacterial infection, you want to find unique cells that prokaryotic cells have that human cells may not. And then if you're treating a eukaryotic infection, like a yeast infection, yeast are made up of eukaryotic cells. We're also human cells made up of eukaryotic cells. So that one's a little bit trickier to treat, because you have to find unique cells, unique things in eukaryotic cells that you might not find in human cells. And also, understanding cells is so important to understand things like cancer cells, how they divide, how they reproduce, as well as producing treatment for various types of infections, diseases. So that's cells. Prokaryotic cells make up bacteria and an organism called archaea. Everything else is a eukaryotic cell. Humans, plants, mold, fungus, protozoa, like the organism that causes malaria, etc.